Hi, this is Michelle Hunter with the Times-Picayune newspaper. I'm coming to you after opening arguments in the second-degree murder trial of Ronald Gasser. Mr. Gasser is accused in the death of former NFL player Joe McKnight. The trial began actually on Tuesday. They had jury selection. They completed selecting a panel on Tuesday night, but because of the wintry weather in Jefferson Parish and all around the region, that delayed the start of trial until this morning. So this morning we got a taste of what we will see. This is expected to be a 2-week trial with lots and lots and lots of witnesses. We found a couple of the reasons why this morning. Apparently the jury is going to watch all 3 of Ronald Gasser's videotaped statements with the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office. One of those interviews is apparently 8.5 hours long, and the jury must watch all 8.5 hours. We're told that there's even 2 hours of it, of him just kind of sitting there waiting as a detective leaves the room and comes back in. So that means that it's going to be quite a long trial. There are lots of witnesses, apparently lots of witnesses who witnessed the chase in various versions of it, including expert witnesses as well. So this morning, Assistant District Attorney Seth Shute opened for the prosecution. They said that Mr. Gasser is accused of killing Mr. McKnight at the intersection of Berman and Holmes on December 1st, 2016 in Terrytown. The gist of the prosecution's case, they're not running away from the fact that there was this road rage altercation. Apparently there were witnesses from the Crescent City Connection, the chase. It was 5 miles from the bridge down General de Gaulle to Berman Highway and on to Berman Highway. It's sort of heading towards La Palco. They're not running away, they said, from the fact that McKnight was he participated in the chase. They were both sort of kind of chasing each other and cutting around each other. And it stopped at the intersection of Berman and Holmes, and that Mr. McKnight pulled up next to Mr. Gasser, stood at the window, and then fired. Excuse me, I'm sorry, somebody's passing by. Mr. McKnight walked up to the window. They were still arguing, and Mr. Gasser, still seated in the driver's seat of his vehicle, fired 3 shots at Mr. McKnight. What prosecutors told today, basically, one of the reasons it seems like they went forward with the murder charge is gunshot residue evidence. They said that when a gun is fired in close contact with someone, there's something called stippling, which he called a gunpowder tattoo, which shows that a person was very close. Apparently, Mr. Gasser made statements that Joe McKnight was inside of his vehicle and lunging for him, and the sheriff's office and prosecutors feel like the evidence doesn't fit Mr. Gasser's version of events. Because there was no stippling on Mr. McKnight's body, they don't believe that he was as close as Mr. Gasser says that he was. The other thing they talked about was sort of the location of the injuries on Mr. McKnight. Seth Shute in particular discussed an injury to Mr. McKnight's shoulder. He said that if Mr. McKnight was actually reaching into the vehicle in the way that Gasser said, there would be a hole in his muscle on his shoulder, and they said that a forensic pathologist will come in and explain that that hole is just not there. So they seem to be basing their assertion that Mr. Gasser is guilty of murder, saying that evidence, particularly this gunshot residue and the location of the wound, just does not match what Mr. Gasser said occurred. Mr. Gasser gave 3 different statements to the sheriff's office. Remember, the first occurred shortly after the shooting. It was the night of December 1st. That statement, I think, lasted between 3:55 and midnight. He was released without being arrested. That caused a huge uproar here. Matthew Goetz, who is Mr. Gasser's attorney, got up and he reiterated their assertion that Mr. Gasser was not the aggressor in the case, that he acted in self-defense. He talked about McKnight actually being inside of the vehicle. He said there was blood evidence inside of the vehicle, which they claim shows that McKnight was actually inside of the car. He says that under the state's justifiable homicide laws, that means that Mr. Gasser acted lawfully, that he was in fear for his life. The defense paints the picture that it was Joe McKnight, who was driving erratically, had cut off Mr. Gasser. The defense attorney says he actually tried to kill his client in trying to run him off the road and chasing him down General de Gaulle, and repeated attempts to run him off the road. And that by the time they got to the intersection, that when Joe McKnight pulled up next to Ronald Gasser, he essentially trapped him inside of his vehicle. Mr. Gasser stayed inside of his vehicle, and the defense attorney says that Gasser was afraid for his life, faced with, a rather large former professional athlete, and who was threatening him and using obscenities. And so in that way, Mr. Gasser was defending himself against someone who had gotten out of his vehicle and was making threats. To me, Mr. Guts also seemed to invoke part of the justifiable homicide law that I had spoken with legal experts about, particularly the Castle Doctrine, which talks about whether or not force can be used when someone is trying to make entry into your car. And under state law, according to legal experts, lethal force can be used to prevent the entry of your vehicle or your home if you think the force is necessary to stop the person or to prevent or get them to stop. So it seems like they are saying that he was justified because he was in fear for his life and he was attempting to stop the entry of his vehicle. Those seem to be the arguments. Again, to recap the prosecution says it just didn't seem, the evidence just does not support what Mr. Gasser says. Prosecutors say that Mr. Gasser claimed that Joe McKnight was lunging at him and attacking him inside the vehicle, and because there was no stippling on McKnight's body, it showed that he just wasn't as close as Mr. Gasser claims, and they said a position of the gunshot wound, particularly one in the shoulder, showed that his arm wasn't raised. He wasn't, trying to get at Mr. Gasser. The defense says that McKnight was indeed inside the vehicle, that Mr. Gasser was scared for his life, and he acted in self-defense. The first witness has taken the stand. It is a 911 operator. It sounds like they're going to be playing the 911 calls that came in that day. During opening, we heard in particular that the first 911 caller was a woman who actually was positioned directly behind Mr. Knight. Mr. McKnight, at the intersection of Berman and Terry Parkway. No, I'm sorry, it's Holmes and Berman. My apologies. That she was actually behind them. She hasn't testified yet, but according to the prosecutors, she didn't actually see the shooting. She was kind of looking down, and then she heard the gunshots, looked up, saw Mr. McKnight fall, and then she drove to a nearby business, and she was the first person to make the first 911 call. We're getting ready to put a story together with some of the information from the opening arguments, and we'll head back in and cover witnesses, and hopefully we'll bring in a little more information. But this is the first day of what is expected to be a 2-week trial. It is going to be a long one. There are lots of witnesses on both sides, lots of experts, lots of lay witnesses, lots of people from the sheriff's office. So stay with NOLA.com as we provide you more information.